On today's episode, we're painting up this crazy little guy. I think I'm going to call him Stumpy. Hey guys, Michael here. So let's jump into it with today's project. So we've got this little miniature stump guy that we're going to be painting up today. So the very first thing that we've got to do is we've got to base coat him in black primer, and I'm using the Vallejo primer. So a little bit of magic there, and we are base coated. From here we're going to start layering this up, and the very first thing that we'll have to do is put a brown base coat. So I like to use the Porconi paints for this, which is made by Dwarf Flesh, and what I'm using is called base wood. So with the base wood, we just want even coverage over the entire surface. I'm going to go ahead and put it into the little eye sockets and the mouth. The only thing that I'm really not hitting with this color is the very top, because I want it to look like that has been cut off, because wood is typically a little lighter on the inside of the tree than the bark on the outside. So I'm going to use a different color for that area. Because of that, I'll leave the black primer kind of across the top, and I won't bother base coating it in the base wood coat. If you get a little bit on that area, it doesn't matter because you're going to cover it up, but just remember that the lighter color that we're going to do for the cutoff section of the tree is probably going to take a couple of coats. Now the brown, we're only going to give it just the one coat, because if it doesn't cover completely, it really won't matter. All of our other effects and colors are going to totally disguise any spaces that are not covered. So that's it for our brown base coat, and now we will let this dry before we move on to our next step. That next step, of course, being another Porconi paint. So this time we are using a color called Stucco, and we are using that to base out the very top of the tree. So with stucco has kind of an undertone of pink. It's not a pure off-white, but I like it in combination with browns an awful lot, and if you do a wash over it, it has a really nice effect. So like I said, this is probably going to take multiple coats to get perfect coverage. I'm just making sure to keep it neat and even and get down into the little cuts and grooves of our actual casting. Now, if you didn't guess by the brown color of this when we started, this is actually cast in resin, not cast in our typical Merlin's Magic plaster. And the resin is kind of nice because it preserves a lot of details. So we'll let this dry, and then we're going to get started with our first Vallejo color, which is called Hot Orange. So with the hot orange, we are just going to hit the eye sockets and the open mouth, and we want to wrap that up onto the sides and extend just slightly past where you think you would be stopping. The goal here is to do a glow effect, so we want to make sure that we cover just a little bit onto the surface of the actual tree trunk. If you haven't guessed now, my glow effect is going to wind up being orange when we are all said and done. Now Vallejo is my paint of choice, of course, but you can use whatever brand that you prefer. But I do have the color on the screen there just so that you get an idea of what color I'm actually using here. Vallejo is nice because although you will have to thin it in later stages for this first base coat, it is pretty much ready to go right out of the bottle. And I love this style of bottle because I can dispense a drop out. Alright, our next step, we're going to go back with just a hint more of the stucco across the top. I told you that I thought that we were going to need a second coat. And of course, as this started to dry, I could tell that we did in fact need that second coat. So just a quick touch up and we are ready to move on. So we will now let this dry a little bit and we can move in with our next step, which is to add our first dry brush. So I am using another Porconi color, which is called Cavern Dry Brush. So when you do a dry brush, of course, you want to get a little bit of paint on your brush and then wipe almost all of that paint back off of the brush. And you're just going to really carefully skim across the top of your model, just catching the highest points and giving this a slight dusty highlight. We will be doing a wash to this, so most of our dry brush is going to disappear when the wash goes on there, but I like to do this step before the wash goes on just to build up that extra layer of color. I think it helps the final piece look like it has a little more depth. So that's it for the dry brush step, and another dry later, and we are ready to move on to our next color, which is called Dwarf Flesh. Now, Dwarf Flesh is very similar to the orange palettes that we are working with, but it has a slightly more fleshy tan kind of a look. Now with this, we are going to thin this down about 50-50 with just straight water. We don't want to use it at full strength or this will be way too solid and it will cover up the base coat of orange that we laid down a minute ago. So if you noticed, I mixed this up and then I just tested a small swipe on the back of my thumbnail just to see if I got the consistency where I wanted it. It's okay if this goes on and looks like it's covering a little bit more than it should be. Remember that as this dries, the transparency will come out and you'll get a little bit more of that background color peeking through. So very simple, light layer of the dwarf skin, and we're ready to move on to our next step. And with that step, we are adding another Vallejo color into the mix. This time it's a yellow called Gold Yellow, which is the darker of the two yellows that we're going to be using. Now you only need the barest minimum of a drop, and then you want to thin this out with water. I would say somewhere around that 60 to 70% water to paint. Get this a little thinner than you got the last layer, which will allow that previous layer to show through a little bit. And again, we're just building this up to get the effect that we're looking for. With each layer, we're going to let it be a little deeper in the recess, by which I mean we're not going to go quite as close to the surface of the stump and the bark as we did on the previous layer. By doing this, we'll make it look like the deepest sections of the eyes and the mouth are where the glow is actually coming from. So you can see we've got this layer done, so time to let this part of it dry a little bit and then we will move on to our next color. Alright, with the next color we are using Vallejo's Moon Yellow, which again I have displayed down at the bottom of the screen. And you only need just the tiniest amount of this, fairly thin. With this one, I would say hit somewhere between 75 and 80% water to paint. This really should be like a wash. It's okay if it goes on and looks like you have flooded the surface. The bubbles will dry out as the water evaporates out, and you'll just be left with this small little skim of paint. And that's all we are doing for this layer. Alright, we are all dried up from the moon yellow, which means that we are ready to move on to our wash. So we are using a Vallejo wash called Sepia Shade. We don't need a lot of it. We're just going to put a little bit on our dish here. And we want to evenly cover all of the wood areas. And we want to pay special attention to not let it run down into any of the sections that we've painted with the orange tones for our glow effects. If it ran down in there, it would muddy out that effect and probably cause us to have to repaint those sections. So I'm just progressing my way around the trunk of our little guy first, and then before we finish, we will set the whole thing down, and we will use the same sepia to coat across the top. This would be the area that we put the stucco paint on, and the wash has a really wonderful effect when applied over that gives it kind of that aged wood look, which is exactly what we're going for on this piece. So once you've covered the whole thing, we're going to of course set this aside one more time to allow our wash to have a chance to fully dry. Washes dry slower than paint, so make sure you give it a good long rest. Alright, we're back. Our wash has now fully dried, and we are ready for our last color, which is Vallejo's Hot Orange. This is the brightest orange that we are using, and it is also going to be the one that we use the least of with the most water. You should, again, mix this like a wash. Very little paint, mostly water. And our goal with this is going to be to coat over all of the previous layers of yellows and oranges and extend ever so slightly onto the face of our little stump guy, which I am definitely naming Stumpy. So Stumpy, we want to have a slight glow effect over his whole face. I don't want it to be really pronounced, but I do want it to be noticeable versus the sides and back of the wood. So by allowing it to kind of ooze out just ever so slightly onto the surface, we will get that kind of ever so slight glowing effect. And what we'll do is we will blot a little of this back off with a paper towel, just so that it doesn't get too bright or too dark. Now what I am doing now is I'm doing some wet blending, so I have taken all of the glaze off of my brush, and I now just have straight plain water, and I'm just moving the glaze around, and then you can see I've started to blot just a little bit so that it doesn't get too dark, and then we will go back in with just a little bit more around the mouth line and around the eyes. And right now I've got it pretty much where I want it, with the exception of taking those pooled areas of glaze off of it. So to do that, you want to dry out your brush and then just tap the dry bristles against any area that has pooled, and this will pull our wet orange glaze out, so that we get a nice crisp line of detail. Once you've got it where you want it, you're going to allow this to dry one more time, and then we will come back and finish it up with just a little bit more of our dark sepia wash, mostly around the face, just to intensify the color of the glow a little bit. Be very selective where you put this. I'm mostly adding it onto the sides, so that they stay a little bit more pronounced against the glow of the face. And then we will allow this to dry one more time. Alright, we're back and we're ready to wrap this up with another Porconi color. This is called Stone Edge Dry Brush, which is going to be our finished dry brush color. So with the Stone Edge, I'm just going to really lightly do a dry brush over the wood sections of this piece just to bring out the pattern a little bit. The Stone Edge is very similar to the Cavern dry brush, but it has a little bit more of a cream tone to it, and I think it brings out the piece really nicely. So I'm paying special attention to any areas that I think are catching light, and I'm also going to make sure that I catch all the edges of the broken top of Stumpy here, where the bark extends slightly above the cut wood that we painted up with the stucco color. By doing this, we will be able to highlight all of the wonderful sculpt that we have in this piece and kind of get the most out of it. So again, with the dry brush, we're using a very tiny amount of paint, and we're just allowing our brush to catch the highest points of it, and I am using a smaller brush to do this to control it even further. So at this point, we are pretty much done the painting process on this. All that is left is really to seal this in to make sure that our work is preserved and lasting. As far as sealer goes, I am going to go to my standards, which are the Vallejo gloss acrylic varnish and matte acrylic varnish. The matte being for the main body, and I will use the gloss for the eye sockets and the mouth. But I'm not going to show that in the video just because it doesn't really show up on camera. So as always, thank you for checking out the video, and leave me questions if you've got them. Hey, if you like these videos and want to help me keep making them, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button.